Okay, that's a picture of a neighborhood in Sao Paulo, the biggest city in Brazil, and it shows very graphic inequalities. Today's talk is really a story of two curves. On the left-hand side, we have the Kuznets curve, which suggests that when countries industrialize, income inequality increases. But after a certain level, in the post-industrial phase, to paraphrase Peter Mandelson, we can be pretty relaxed about people getting filthy rich because inequality will come down eventually. On the right-hand side, we have the Preston curve. I think you'll hear more about it from the talks later on today. But it's a curve of GDP against life expectancy, and so when GDP rises, life expectancy rises. But for the top countries, the richest countries, there's no association. And the argument is that what really matters for the rich countries is not how rich they are, but the level of inequality there is within the country. And so there have been a number of associations produced, such as in this particular example of the green refers to American states, the red refers to Canadian states, showing some sort of association between the level of inequality on the x-axis and the death rate. It seems to be stronger for the American states where there are higher levels of inequality and weaker for Canadian states. That kind of association has been produced a number of times, and in Brazil as well, where you've got this Gini coefficient, a lower Gini coefficient being associated with a higher life expectancy in Brazilian states. Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett have produced quite a lot of these results. They did a systematic review showing that when you measure income inequality at the national level, about 83% of all the studies they found are supportive of this idea that a higher level of income inequality is associated with higher levels of mortality and lower life expectancy. However, when you measure income inequality at a smaller geographical level, like at the counties or within parishes, the evidence is not quite so strong. And this throws up the question, what is the right level at which we should be measuring inequality? So in this particular paper, I think Richard said that, when we're talking about inequality, the scale of inequality, the appropriate level at which to measure the scale of inequalities is at the national level, because at a smaller geographical level, you might not get the same degree of heterogeneity as you would do at a national level. For people who are perhaps more interested in a psychosocial approach to understanding what could be happening here, that seems a little counterintuitive, because who you compare yourself against is probably people in your neighborhood, within a smaller geographical scale than, say, people in some other very distant area. The trouble with a lot of these measures of inequality is that they don't take into account the spatial dimension of inequality. So on this next slide, we have got 4 different neighborhoods, all with the same numbers of poor people in them, so hence the same poverty rate, hence the same Gini coefficient, but very, very different in terms of the spatial distribution of poverty. So on the bottom left quadrant, you have the most unequal spatially distributed neighborhood, where the poor people are clustered and isolated in the neighborhoods where they live. And on the top right-hand quadrant, you have got the does this work? Yep. In the top right-hand quadrant, we've got the least segregated of the neighborhoods, where the poor and rich sort of coexist across the different neighborhoods where they live. One thing to remember is that residential segregation is just the spatial manifestation of income inequality. So income inequality, if we look at it as in terms of who lives where, it really is in terms of, it gets spatially manifested in residential segregation. Some of you may be wondering why look at Brazil in particular. So apart from saying that the ESRC paid me to look at Brazil, Brazil is interesting because it's really, really very urban. It's much more urban than the EU average. It's more urban than the United States. And within Brazilian cities, in terms of income inequality, they pretty much have the highest levels of income inequality within Brazilian cities. They're only beaten by Johannesburg over there top. So, in terms of urbanization, urbanization is by definition a spatial concentration of economic activity. And so we know that spatial concentrations of rich people tend to reproduce the privileges of the rich, and spatial concentration of poor people tends to result in segregation and ghettoization. The question that this particular research posed was, is the spatial concentration element as important or just as important as being poor, as living in a poor neighborhood? So is there a triple health jeopardy of, not only is there detriment to your health if you're poor and if you live in a poor neighborhood, but if you live in a spatially isolated poor neighborhood, is that a triple whammy? We know, the UN Habitat has produced a number of reports about the spatial poverty trap and spatial isolation. We know that in neighborhoods where there are spatially isolated, there's severe lack of employment opportunities. And because women tend to work as domestic labor, if they live in a poor neighborhood, they can't find work, so they have to travel far to find employment as domestic labor, but they can't then balance out their family responsibilities. We know that if you're spatially isolated, you're off the map. We know that policymakers are not particularly interested in you because you're isolated. So you don't get public transport, you don't get hospitals, you don't get schools. That leads to social exclusion, marginalization, and worsening living conditions. And in terms of correlations, we know that spatially isolated areas tend to be high crime areas. There are a number of different measures of segregation that have developed since the 60s and 70s. I list 5 of them over here: evenness, exposure, clustering, centralization, concentration. The trouble with these more traditional measures is that they're non-spatial, they're aspatial. And this leads to 2 problems: the checkerboard and comparability problem. The checkerboard problem rises from the fact that each neighborhood is considered in isolation from each other. So it neglects the overall social composition of the space. So on the left-hand side, on the left and right-hand side, you have exactly the same numbers of poor people or black squares, but very different levels of inequality by the spatial distribution of the poor people. The second problem is the comparability problem, or the modifiable area unit problem, where you've got, very often we define neighborhoods in terms of administrative units, and so this means that it's not easy to compare one administrative unit to another administrative unit because there are always problems of aggregation. So it's by convenience we use administrative units to define neighborhoods, but actually it would be more useful if we had a more spatial definition of a neighborhood. And in the last 10 years, 10-15 years, there have been new measures of segregation that have been developed that are spatial measures of segregation, and the software and GIS that's necessary for calculating these measures have been newly developed. Underlying all of these new measures of spatial segregation is the idea that we measure the distance between one area from another area in terms of the centroid, the geographical centroid of a particular neighborhood or a particular ward. And as long as we make certain assumptions, like the distribution of the decay function is normal, we estimate what the bandwidth is. We can use these kinds of assumptions to get at an estimate of the weight of a neighboring district or neighboring area on the area of which you live. So that's the key thing. Through the spatial measures, you get an estimate of how much does your neighbor's data
does your neighbor's social composition affect your own social composition? And luckily for us, those 5 or 6 different dimensions of residential segregation gets reduced to only 2 spatial dimensions, an evenness clustering dimension and an isolation exposure dimension. I'm going to be concentrating on the exposure isolation dimension because that's by far the most easy to interpret. So, and especially at the isolation end, we get these measures of spatial isolation that refer to, if you're a poor person, what's the likelihood that you live, that your neighbor is another poor person? So what's the likelihood that you will bump into
another poor person in the neighborhoods where poor people live? My Brazilian colleague in Porto Alegre, Sergio Bassinesi, has been calculating all these spatial measures, spatial isolation measures for the project. And this is a picture of Porto Alegre, whereby we've got the downtown area very in the middle over here. That's the riverside and the bay and the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean over here. It's a classic donut shape whereby the rich are clustered in the downtown area, and in the surrounding further away areas we have the poor clustered. This is in terms of, for those of you who can't quite see, it's in Brazilian reais, so that it's a heat map, so the darker areas are the poorer households. This can be, so what I just showed you were in terms of the 73 districts within Porto Alegre. A district in a Brazilian context is about equivalent to an English ward. And if we break it down into the census tract areas, so these are based on census data, so without Brazilian census data, we wouldn't have this data. So when we break it down into census tracts, we can see that in terms of the richest groups, greater than 20 minimum salaries. A minimum salary in Brazil is about 400 reais. So back in 2001, that was about 100 pounds per month. So over here we have the poorest groups living on less than 2 minimum salaries, and over here we have the richest groups living on more than 20 minimum salaries. And you can see that how as you get from rich to poor, the spatial distribution of the poor groups gets increasingly spread out to the surrounding areas. We can calculate these spatial measures of isolation. The richest group, more than 20 minimum salaries, they constitute 6% of the population, of Porto Alegre's population, and yet their spatial isolation measures 0.23. In other words, there's a 23% likelihood that they will meet another rich person in the neighborhoods where rich people live, despite being only 6% of the population. That's also true at the other end of the scale. We've got about 16.3% of the Porto Alegre population being poor. That's actually quite a rich city. It's only 16.3% who have in the poorest category between 0 to 800 Brazilian reais per month. And yet, despite being, they have a spatial isolation index of 0.31, so almost double their population percentage. It's about 31% likelihood that they will only ever meet another poor person in their neighborhoods. These are the standard sort of correlations that show sort of relatively strong correlations at a district level between mortality on the y-axis and different measures of, say, income. As income increases in districts, mortality decreases. As income inequality increases, in the red, mortality increases. And as spatial isolation of the poorest increases in those districts, those mortality also increases. When we put them all into a model, well, if we just have it within the model predicting mortality rates in these districts, we see that a 1 unit increase in mean income, so one Brazilian reais, is associated with a decrease in mortality of about 1 per 1,000 deaths. When we put income inequality in there, the effect of mean income reduces to non-significance, and the Gini coefficient suggests that as you go from 0 to 100% inequality, so no inequality to complete inequality in terms of income inequality, you have an increase in the mortality rate by about 15 per 1,000 population. However, when you put all three measures in, what tends to stand out is that the spatial measure is the one that really is doing most of the predicting. It's the best fitting model. As you go from no spatial inequality to living in a neighborhood where all the poor people are spatially isolated, you have a big jump in the mortality rates, and the income inequality and the mean income are no longer statistically significant. This is true particularly for cardiovascular disease, but also it's true for infectious diseases as well. The scales jump up because now the mortality rate is per 100,000 population. So we took this Porto Alegre data and we looked at doing similar analysis for all over Brazil, all the main cities in Brazil. And here's their distribution. Porto Alegre is in the rich south over here. Of particular interest are those cities in the very poor northeast area, and Recife in particular. We calculated the spatial isolation indices for the poorest groups and the richest groups, as well as the middle income groups. And it's not surprising to see that if you're in the south for the southern cities, in the northeast cities, which is the poorest, the purple line over here, if you're more likely to be living in a highly isolated neighborhood, spatially isolated neighborhood. But on the richer end of things, there's really not much difference between the four regions in terms of spatial isolation of the rich people. So this U-shaped distribution is quite common. So we know that poor people tend to live in spatially isolated neighborhoods, and so do rich people. But particularly if you're poor and living in the northeast. Finally, my last couple of slides show when we look at the interactions between spatial isolation and whether or not you live in a poor city. It's actually if you're in a spatially isolated neighborhood and you're living in the rich Porto Alegre city, you have got a high risk of mortality. Whereas if you're spatially isolated, living in the poorer northeast or northern regions, there doesn't seem to be much of an association with mortality. And on the other end of the scale, if you're living in a least spatially isolated neighborhood, i.e. a rich neighborhood, it really doesn't matter which region you live in, whether it's rich or poor. Just to give you a couple of examples of where those neighborhoods are, this is the Porto Alegre neighborhood. As you can see, it's Restinga. This is the rich city, Porto Alegre, and it's really far away from the downtown rich area over here where all the services are based. This is Recife, that northeast city, and this is Recife. It's also poor. It's also spatially isolated, but you can see it's bang in the middle of the downtown area. So, just to summarize, maybe there is some legs to this idea that it's the spatial isolation, the spatial segregation part that is especially important for income inequality. And living in a rich city is not protective of your health if you live in a spatially segregated neighborhood. So just to summarize, it's no surprise, we all know that if you live in a poor area, you're likely to have higher mortality rates in those areas. What's perhaps new is that if you are living in a spatially isolated area where the poor are spatially isolated, those areas also have high mortality rates. And so, just imagine if we had a policy that increased the spatial isolation of the poor. For example, if you tended to send out poor people away from the rich neighborhoods where they live and had a policy whereby they are housed in poor regions or poor cities or poor neighborhoods, that spatial concentration will probably, if you believe that there is a causal association going on here, and that's a big if, that spatial concentration could result in increasing levels of morbidity and mortality. Thank you.